As a cultural anthropologist and artist studying the varieties of Latinos in Milwaukee, I was truly amazed at how they were able to capture their history and cultures through their artwork.
Our anthropologists that were interviewing the Latinos in Milwaukee were struck by the diversity of the Latino experience here, given the number of Latino nations represented and the ethnic and class diversity within these nations. They were surely impressed with the ways that the Latino labor force had helped sustain both our local and national economy when we needed it sometimes the most. And they found numerous examples locally where strong Latino families and faith communities had stabilized our neighborhoods.
These are the stories of the Latino experience, as described by a variety of Latino residents in the Midwestern city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Just who are these Latinos, and why are their stories diverse? For our purposes, we speak of the U.S. Latinos as people who trace their ancestry to primarily Spanish-speaking Caribbean and Latin American worlds. These include nations with very different experiences. First, these nations are populated by people of varying combination of ethnic backgrounds. While all the nations have substantial numbers of people who can trace their ancestry to the Iberian Peninsula, many in Colombia, coastal Venezuela, Panama, and the Caribbean also trace their ancestry to Africa, mainly through the transatlantic slave trade. On the other hand, people of African descent are largely absent in Argentina, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. And in Argentina, substantial number of people also trace their ancestry to northern European countries. In addition, the indigenous or Indian populations of these Latino areas have played disparate roles in national development. In some regions, the early indigenous populations helped forge later national identities. For example, the Aztec, Mayans, and Incas have developed very complex societies, and these traditions became important in later national development. Other indigenous populations, such as the Caribs of the Caribbean and northern South America, and the Yanomami of Venezuela and Brazil, have only recently begun to demonstrate influence on national identities. Second, the histories of these nations has been diverse. While all the regions were at one time colonized by European nations, the colonial experience varied. For example, Costa Rica was a Spanish colony but offered few easily exploitable resources. Early on, the indigenous population was ravaged by European diseases and the overwhelming majority died off. The few survivors retreated to the forests, remote valleys, or Nicoya Peninsula. Spanish settlers that moved in were left to their own devices, mostly farming the land themselves, and the area never developed the rigid feudal system experienced in other Spanish enclaves. Later, the United States played a key role in this orbit of colonialism. Throughout the 19th century, U.S. policies and events resulted in a larger national land base and the establishment of the U.S. as the dominant power in the Americas. These events included the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 that stated that the American continents were henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future conquest by any European powers. Later, during the aftermath of the Mexican-American War of 1846-1848, Mexico lost approximately half of its northern territory to the U.S. And during the aftermath of the Spanish-American War of 1898, Puerto Rico became a U.S. possession. Third, while most of the Latino nations in the Americas have been rigidly class stratified and face ongoing challenges with widespread poverty, their actual class structures vary from area to area. In the Caribbean islands alone, class statuses may be determined by political power or wealth, or the order in which ethnic groups arrive, or religion, or even urban-rural divisions. In other areas, class divisions can be influenced by indigenous status, vis-a-vis European origins.
There's definitely like a discrimination in regards to like the local, more of Indian-based people as opposed to the more European-based looking people. You know, you definitely, from the town where I was from, you could definitely see that there was, you know, people, for instance, that like were, so to speak, whiter skin, more European-based, you know, culture, whatnot. You could definitely tell that there was some sort of, you know, power over, say, you know, the lower class, which typically happen to be like the more indigenous, you know, related people.
It would be the complex issues of social class with its impacts on widespread poverty and political unrest, plus the dominance of the United States in the Americas, that would eventually lead to the Latino migration to the United States. In the 20th century, several patterns of immigration arose. The patterns seen nationwide are also reflected in the Milwaukee experience. The first of these patterns was the more or less uninterrupted flow of legal and sometimes undocumented immigration from Mexico. This flow has been influenced by political unrest and poverty in Mexico and the needs of the United States to supplement its workforce. Many Mexicans were directly recruited by U.S. agricultural and industrial enterprises such as plantations, farms, tanneries, mines, foundries, construction companies, and railroads. A substantial proportion of Mexicans that began as rural workers have later transitioned to the urban labor force, often taking up permanent residence in the United States.
The Mexican Americans that arrived here in Wisconsin came in, you know, for different types of jobs. In the urban areas like Milwaukee, there were a lot of people who came here with the railroads. Sometimes they were working in agriculture. But quite a few of the folks that I'm familiar with came in through the agricultural industry. They came here as migrant farm workers to work in the fields and harvest the crops. And they then decided to relocate into the city of Milwaukee, Madison, and other areas, and became assimilated with the population. But to this day, there are still migrant workers that work in Wisconsin. We have anywhere between 8,000 to 9,000 people that come here on an annual basis.
My fondest memories is actually when I was working on farms with my brothers and sisters. We came up here from Texas, and we were going to Sturgeon Bay and areas up north to do cherry picking and things like this, all different kinds of fruits and vegetables. But one thing I remember is there were so many different cousins and brothers and sisters. We were all jammed into, there'd be like 3 or 4 families jammed into one house, you know, but we did what we could just to get by.
While we were living in the area on the south side, on 4th and Bruce, later we moved to 7th and Greenfield, and some of the Polish neighbors that we had were not too happy with some of the Mexicans because they had been brought in the early 20s to break a strike at one of the tanneries. And they told me about how they had taken jobs away from some of the Polish individuals who worked at those tanneries, not realizing that the Mexicans didn't know that they had been brought here to break a strike or to do anything, you know, to hurt other people. They were recruited, like my father in the past were recruited to come and do a job here. And because they knew that Mexicans were very good workers, they went down and got a whole bunch of Mexicans and put them to work in that factory, that company. It actually was a tannery.
Another of these migration patterns has been the circular migration of Latinos from the Caribbean areas. Many of these Latinos have migrated for temporary work, either independently or because they held U.S. labor contracts. While most then return to their homes when a period of work is over, some eventually established permanent residence in the United States.
Puerto Ricans and Latinos in general tend to come to the United States many times due to economic reasons, looking for work. I know that many Puerto Ricans back perhaps in the 60s migrated to Milwaukee because of all the factory work and the migrant work that was available, and ended up staying here. And I'm a product of that generation, with my grandparents having come here for that very same purpose. So that's their circular migration coming, whether it's from Puerto Rico or Mexico, for economic reasons, to be able to send money back to their native countries to support those families there as well.
The job market in Milwaukee was a huge impact, I believe, at least for my family, moving here, because it gave us an opportunity to earn a living when things in Puerto Rico were a little hard. So the process was that my mother came first and found a job, but then my aunt came, and then my father, and then the rest of the family were brought to Milwaukee.
The last of these migration patterns has been the more time-limited, large-scale waves of immigration from the Caribbean islands and Central and South America. Many of these immigrants have sought asylum from political unrest and oppression back home. In the middle of the 20th century, most asylum seekers were Cubans, fleeing the Castro regime. Since the early 1980s, many have also come from El Salvador and Guatemala, as well as Cuba.
I think the reason that Cubans came to Milwaukee, as well as other northern cities, was reasons of politics in Cuba. When the Castro revolution took place, many Cubans were driven out or didn't want to participate in the revolution, so they left. And the reason they came to Milwaukee, as in other places, was for economic reasons. They most likely came through Miami and were relocated out of Miami by the church or other social service agencies which were trying to move Cubans out of Miami as soon as possible, and Milwaukee was one of those places where Cubans ended up.
Today, the Latino population in the city of Milwaukee roughly reflects the Latino population nationally. According to the 2000 census, approximately 60% of all Latinos nationally, as well as in Milwaukee, are Mexican Americans. The next most numerous group is from Puerto Rico, and in Milwaukee, over 1/4 of all Latinos are Puerto Rican. The city is also home to a smaller number of people from other Caribbean, Central American, and South American countries. The Latino population overall is the fastest growing ethnic group in the U.S., as well as in Milwaukee. Here the population has doubled in the last 10 years, reaching over 100,000. In a Milwaukee study conducted by local cultural anthropologists, Latinos of various national backgrounds were interviewed about the cultural traditions, practices, and ideas they brought with them to the United States. They were also asked ways that these practices varied across Latino groups and how the practices have changed while in the U.S. In addition, neighborhood leaders from non-Latino or Anglo backgrounds were asked about the influence of these diverse practices on the wider community. Some of the traditions, practices, and ideas that emerged as most prominent included economic pursuits, family relations, religious and healing practices, and expressive culture. The U.S. government and businesses have a long history of recruiting Latinos to work in the U.S. when the local citizenry could not meet labor needs. These transactions range from recruiting Central Americans to work in coffee factories in the late 1800s, to farm labor programs, to railroad building, to war industry jobs during World War II, to tanneries in Milwaukee. In many cases, the Latino workforce has sustained the highly competitive position of the U.S. in the world economy. For example, ethnic scholars such as Sutton and Cheney point out to the essential role of Caribbeans in the success of New York City. Puerto Rican and Dominican women have effectively kept the garment industry in New York from moving elsewhere. The willingness of Caribbeans to work in service jobs in hotels, the transportation industry, and restaurants has helped New York remain the tourist capital of the world. Latino workers have come to this country with a variety of skills, depending in part on the areas of origin and to an even larger extent on their social class status. Some indigenous people, such as the Mixtec and the Zapotec of Mexico and the Mayans of Guatemala, have migrated to the U.S. with very low educational levels, while a relatively large number of Cubans, Central Americans, and South Americans have migrated to the U.S. with professional statuses. Latinos of diverse backgrounds have gravitated towards a variety of jobs and business enterprises.
As the neighborhood changes, the Hispanic presence is more evident. There's mainly young people, first generation, blue collar. One thing that makes it interesting is their tenacity and their willingness to do the basic chores that nobody wants to do. Their tenacity and their willingness is what's creating or brewing some type of force that has not fully developed yet. And I think that's something that is going to be a positive tool to have as the time goes by. It's a group that we should be watching.
There's been a tremendous influx of Latino-owned businesses on Lincoln Avenue in the last 10 years. And that can really be attributed to the work ethic of the Latino culture. There was a need for goods and services on the street that weren't being met elsewhere, and many of the families took it upon themselves to open businesses that would meet those needs.
In 1949, we had a governor by the name of Luis Muñoz Marin, who created a series of operations, is what he called them, for Puerto Rico. One of the first things he did was he created a division of community education where he made sure everybody was able to read and write. People in Puerto Rico are 94.4 literate. It means that 94% of the population can read and write. There are 14 public institutions of higher education and 54 private ones. So education is a big thing in Puerto Rico.
Unfortunately, at times even the best work ethic and education have failed to help Latinos overcome barriers. For Mexicans in particular, immigration restrictions have curtailed their access to the U.S. labor market. Discrimination and nativism here, plus language barriers, have also limited the jobs Latinos can access.
Immigration laws are so unfair that they cause the exploitation of 8 million undocumented workers in the United States. They also are the cause of broken families. Parents are separated from their kids since they are very young, and sometimes for many years, and others they don't see their kids never again. Immigration laws also cause that undocumented workers get treated as criminals while they provide less expensive food for our tables. They take the worst jobs where they can risk their lives and work so many overtimes. They also get paid the poorest salaries. Undocumented workers, usually they don't want to leave their countries. They are just the victims of very unfair factors, including unfair international trade laws that are imposed to their countries by others like United States.
It is often the strength of family ties that has helped Latinos of all backgrounds cope with barriers and change. Ethnic researchers such as Marin and Marin have studied Latino immigrants and stressed the strength of attachments to their nuclear and extended families. In Milwaukee, the mutual commitments provided with these family units have helped stabilize a number of neighborhoods.
The strength of any neighborhood is really dependent upon the amount of home ownership that's in it. And in the last 10 years, we've seen a 10% increase in home ownership with owner-occupied Latino families moving in and really creating this neighborhood and making it their own.
Latino families from all national origins tend to be cohesive, inclusive, and interdependent.
Puerto Rican families tend to stay together, not only the central family, but also the extended family, like the grandparents. Sometimes the younger adults don't leave the home until they're married, and sometimes after they're married and divorced, they come back and live in the home. So Puerto Rico has always had that tradition of the extended families. When there's a wedding or a big event in the family, or even a death, the extended family comes together. So it means that the uncles and the aunts and the nephews and everybody is part of that family. They all stick together. They also include their compadres, and compadres are the godparents of their children. They also become part of that extended family.
Latino culture is family-oriented instead of individualistic as the Anglo culture is. Latino families prefer to keep their children at home during many years until they get married or even later.
Puerto Rico is a small island, so people tend to come here and everyone's related. They come and settle in particular groups, and they bring all their family and their family's family and all their friends, and we're all cousins somehow. The Garcias are related to the Berrios, and the Crespos are related to someone else, so we're all related some way.
Latinos of all backgrounds also practice strong respect for their elders, and grandmothers tend to have special statuses in the family.
The grandmother is the most powerful person in the Latino family. She knows better, and she can have the best advice. She keeps the faith, she keeps the family together, and she's the most interested person in keeping the members of the family helping each other, because she holds the traditions, the faith, and the roots.
In the Latino culture, we have a lot of respect for our elders. As I was growing up as a child, I remember when we would go visit my uncles and my aunts, for example. We would walk in, our parents raised us this way, that we would go in, we would not look at them straight in the eye. We would walk in and greet them by holding their hand and kissing it, and then bowing, and then, you know, making yourself scarce.
However, family structures are not always the same across Latino subgroups. For example, a common family form seen throughout the Caribbean is the matrifocal unit, where family life centers around an older woman and her daughters and grandchildren. Some anthropologists, such as Melville Herskovitz, tried to show how this family form may have been carried over by West African slaves, where multiple wives in a household maintained their own residences. Other anthropologists see this as an adaptation to the experience of slavery in the Caribbean, where men were often deprived of control over their wives and children. The household and the family forms also influenced gender relations, particularly among new immigrants.
The machismo culture exists in most Latino cultures. However, in the Puerto Rican culture, it's the mother or the grandmother, whether it's on the paternal side or the maternal side, that tend to be the focus and tend to be the decision makers in the family. Even if they allow the men to believe that they're making the decisions, it's definitely the matriarch who makes the decisions.
The family unit is so strong in Mexico because the guy has to wait. So it's really a sign of love and a sign that the guy loves you if he's willing to hold back until you get married. And it's part of the family, the traditions and the family units in Mexico is so strong because girls make sure that they love the guy and the guy loves them.
Over time, Latino immigrants often had to adjust some family practices to life in the U.S.
Families at that time were quite large. You know, there was nothing to have a family of 6, a family 8, even 10. And more. And after the Second World War, when most of your young men went into the army, when they came back, they had gone out to see the world, and they weren't going to live in crowded conditions, like when they left, because up until that time, even the houses were small and the families were big, and they kind of, stacked each other. I can remember being stacked at home, on bunk beds and that.
We stayed at home and took care of the children, and the men, well, they will go out and to work, but of course, on the way home, they'll stop by the tavern. Always. So it was, those, now, as I see the difference, now the mothers, because of the times they had changed. You know, the mothers, it's necessary for them to go and work. It's not like on those days.
Another unifying force for most Latinos has been the Catholic Church. 6 of 7 Latinos in the U.S. are Catholic, and nationally, they make up over 1/3 of all U.S. Catholics. Religious orientation also influences settlement patterns of Latinos here. In Milwaukee, the largest group of Latinos live on the near South Side, an area originally settled by Polish and other Eastern European communities. A smaller group of primarily Puerto Rican Latinos also live on Milwaukee's near Northeast Side, an area also settled primarily by Poles, as well as African Americans and a few members of other cultural groups.
Similarities between the Hispanic people and the Polish people. This parish, of course, was founded by Polish people in 1883, and now more and more the neighborhood is changing, and more Hispanics are coming to the church. And not only in Milwaukee, but in major metropolitan areas throughout the United States, Hispanics choose to live alongside Eastern European groups for some reason or other. Perhaps there is a psychological attraction because both groups are primarily Roman Catholic. Both groups have a very deep devotion to the Mother of God under different titles.
Historically, the most effective way to organize Latinos on the near South Side has been through the use of families and church. Organizers today still use these same methods. For example, events such as church festivals, Day of the Dead events, and pastoral lunches are still effective ways to organize.
While the overwhelming majority of Latinos in the U.S. are Catholic, the way Catholicism is practiced varies by area of origin. Latinos brought in diverse customs that were often a synthesis of mystic Hispanic Catholicism and traditions from other ethnic groups, in particular, the local indigenous populations and African slaves. The result was a variety of hybrid practices, ranging from the revelation of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico to Santeria and the Feast of St. John in the Caribbean to Carnival practices in South America.
I think when you look at like the Virgen de Guadalupe, why it's so big down there, I think it's because it represents like the working class, which, you know, the lower class, which is typically probably what most of Mexico is made up from, the large majority of the people. I think they see it as a way of getting to God. I mean, that's the way it's related in terms of like religion-wise. You know, you always see people praying to her to have God do something. So I think it represents a lot with, you know, people portray her as the working people, you know, the working class individual that works on their behalf in regards to God.
Well, the Feast of St. John is actually a religious tradition. St. John the Baptist is the patron of the San Juan, Puerto Rico. And what people have done in the past is that they mixed the religious tradition of St. John the Baptist with a pagan tradition in which the night before the celebration of St. John the Baptist, they go to the beaches, and then they go into the beach at midnight with their backs towards the beach 7 times.
It's a very, very strong component of our culture, the whole idea of mixing indigenous pagan beliefs with African background, because Venezuela has a lot of African influence, and Catholicism. And they've come up with a spirituality that encompasses all these 3 different groups of people. And in Macumba, for instance, you do see the black magic and the white magic being practiced together, and it affects people in the society because they draw from these spiritual beliefs into their everyday lives.
During the early days of Latino immigration, Spanish-speaking worshipers were often relegated to church basements. This allowed many of their cultural-specific practices to continue and operate independently of official church leadership. The healing practices that Latinos of diverse origins brought to the U.S. are related directly and indirectly to the local religious traditions.
In years past, when we were children, our parents would try to do the healing process by, my mother would take an egg and kind of rub it over our body if we weren't feeling well, and supposedly the egg was supposed to absorb what was in your body.
Growing up in Puerto Rico, sometimes we didn't have the money to go out and get prescription drugs, so it was up to my grandmother to go out in the backyard and pick up some medicinal plants and create some type of elixir, I would say.
My mother believes in natural healing. She believes in all the teas and everything you can put in the tea, and the powers of ginger and the powers of prayer and the powers of what is known as Santeria and the powers to the different saints and the different virgins and the rosaries. And they turn to those kind of healing practices before it actually turned to what we here call professional medical advice.
Over time, many Milwaukee Latinos have been influenced by U.S. healthcare practices, but the cultural specific cures and more inclusive views of medicine persist in Latino neighborhoods.
In the case of Mexican, the Latino families inherit the traditions of healing herbs from their ancestors. The Indian who got a big knowledge about healing herbs. The herbs are also medicine for the poorest, those who among Latino families are not able to afford health services. The herbs are also accepted among those who are more educated and want to avoid the secondary effects of secondary standard medicine.
Most Anglos are familiar with Latino expressive culture, from the warmth of Latino personal interaction, to language, to art, to food, to music. One element of expressive culture that is seen among Latinos of all backgrounds is the intimacy of social life.
When I first came to Milwaukee, I found it very difficult because when you meet people, you hug and kiss, and people will give one step backwards. And I thought that maybe I had bad breath or I smelled, you know. So it was really, really shocking. And I had to learn. Remember I went to a priest because I was a volunteer at the choir of Holy Trinity, the Mexican church. And I told the priest, which was an Anglo, bilingual priest, and I told him, what's wrong with you and with your people that you cannot hug? And they explained it to me that hugging and kissing is not part of the American culture.
Latinos, especially Puerto Rican, do not have a personal space. And that is shown when you go to a reunion or a place where the Puerto Ricans, they hug and kiss. And it doesn't mean anything more than I'm so glad to see you. So while other cultures have this personal space where they feel uncomfortable when people get close to them, we don't have that.
On the surface, language would appear to be another unifying factor among Latinos of various national origins. But this is not entirely the case. Even where Spanish is commonly spoken, variation abounds.
Many people in the Mexican culture will use one particular word that will have an absolute different meaning to the Puerto Rican culture, and the same in Venezuela, Argentina.
Most Puerto Ricans like to speak really fast. So they'll be talking to me in Spanish and somebody will turn to me and says, what did he say? And I said, I have no idea. I didn't understand him. He was talking too fast for me. I'll catch a word here and there, you know.
Similarities and differences in expressive culture can be seen in leisure time practices such as games, art, food preparation, and music. For example, while Latinos are competitive in sports everywhere, games of choice vary. The love of soccer is a uniting force among so many Latinos due mainly to the Spanish influence. But baseball rules in the Latino Caribbean areas due mainly to U.S. influence. Likewise with fine arts. Latinos of all backgrounds have used art to convey social and political messages. But artistic styles vary.
It's finally come out that we have a huge number of Latinos living in different communities in the United States. And we've, of course, with these incredible numbers, we've rattled a lot of noise, we made a lot of noise, and it's giving us a chance to show to the community at large that Latin Americans are doing some very interesting contemporary artworks in both dance, in all the aspects of the arts.
Again with Latino cuisine, Latino dishes are known everywhere for their rich flavor, but culinary styles vary from region to region. For example, Mexicans have historically favored corn as a staple food, while Caribbean Latinos favored rice, and South Americans favored wheat and potatoes. And not all Latino dishes are hot. For example, cooks from the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico use more oregano, garlic, and tomatoes to flavor food rather than chiles. Once again with music, Latinos from all regions express themselves through music and dance.
Music has been very important, and is very important in the Mexican tradition. We sing to the dog, to the cat, to the horses. We're animal lovers, okay? We believe that they are part of nature and you gotta respect them.
Caribbean music for us as a culture is very important because everything that is done as far as family gatherings or events in the neighborhood or wherever we live pretty much revolves around the rhythms that came to us from Africa.
However, the musical styles are extremely varied with scores of different genres, ranging from African Caribbean pompa and plena to Colombian cumbia, to Brazilian samba and bossa nova, to Mexican rancheras and polcas norteñas.
The music is wonderful. You have the Cuban music, you have the Dominican music, the Puerto Rican music, the Mexican music, and it's very different in terms of the instruments that are used, the rhythm that it's used, but it's all very lively and you hear it everywhere you go in the city.
Latinos in Milwaukee have faced problems typical of new populations, particularly migrating groups of color. They now live with discrimination, language barriers, low-paying jobs, poor housing, and an educational system not always accommodating to students of different backgrounds. The consolidated efforts needed to overcome these problems have at times been hindered by the internal diversity of the Latino community.
As populations were trying to make a place for themselves in the U.S., sometimes there was some in-house fighting between Latino groups, Puerto Ricans against Mexicans and vice versa. Over the years, people have tried to work with each other, to work together with each other instead of against each other. And there's been an awful lot of friction. There was an awful lot of friction in the early years, still some now, not as much. But I think that once in a while, when an issue comes up that's common to all Latino groups, whether you're Puerto Rican, Mexican, or Cuban, or Nicaraguan, people will try to work together.
In the efforts to unite the community to address common interests, Milwaukee Latinos have created organization after organization and a host of pan-Latino events and resources. The diversity of the community is reflected in the way Latinos have responded to meet common needs. These responses have resulted in different types of programs.
Mexican Fiesta in the Wisconsin Hispanic Scholarship Foundation has been paying attention for the last 30 years in the education area for our youth, for the Latino youths. We believe that education is the key of the progress. And through the foundation, we have been able to give more than $80,000 every year just in scholarships to the Latino students in our community.
Adelante was created for a group of Latinos activists who wanted to present a program in Spanish for the most unprotected. They wanted to do this while the program was focused on social justice, education, and culture. While the general media has a tendency to present Latinos in a negative portrait. Adelante wants to show the efforts and contributions of Latinos on serving their community and the United States.
Milwaukee Latinos have developed these resources without trying to turn this diverse community into a melting pot.
We are talking all the time. We don't lose our Latino culture. All the funds of the Latino community, all the Spanish peoples, we are trying to keep living the same as our countries.
We try to represent many of the Latin American countries that you oftentimes don't see. Not unlike the demographics, that of course we have more Mexicans and Puerto Ricans in the community, there's also a big, huge variety of other countries that we represent here, like Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, and other parts of Latin America, and the Caribbean islands.
Ultimately, it has been the diversity of the Latino community that has multiplied resources in Milwaukee and the U.S. in general. Historically, these groups have helped meet the labor needs of the U.S. during critical periods. Their entrepreneurial activities, strong family ties, and faith communities have stabilized neighborhoods, and their varied forms of art, food, and music have added a richness to U.S. cultural life possibly unparalleled by other ethnic groups.
A buscar mi querer, a soñar